So today we have a new interview with the lead battle director of the Final Fantasy VII Remake Trilogy, Teruki Endo, where he talks a little bit more in depth about crafting the combat system, including the struggles of balancing the ATB system, as well as who is the most challenging character to create. So if any of that sounds cool to you, feel free to click the like button, and if you're new here, you can subscribe, and as always, leave your thoughts in the comments down below. So this interview comes to us from Hayes Madsen of Inverse, who got the chance to sit down with Teruki Endo for an exclusive interview after his GDC panel, where he talked about crafting that combat system, which we did cover. So if you'd like to check that out, I'll leave a link in the description down below to watch that video. Really cool, filled with tons of information on that combat system, all the ins and outs. It's great. But starting off first, they ask Endo if he had any inspirations when crafting this combat system. Endo goes on to say, "I didn't really look at different Final Fantasy titles, as I felt like if I leaned too much on them, it would prevent me from pushing the envelope. I tried to look at it from a very sort of flat and non-biased way. I wanted to take the feeling of a fun command-based battle, that feeling you get, not necessarily the system itself. So I built the system from scratch, and it might have been a coincidence that parts of it felt similar to other games, like Final Fantasy XIII. Now, it's been a long time since I played Final Fantasy XIII, and full transparency, I never finished that game. This was at a point in my life where I was just kind of falling out of love with Final Fantasy and just what Square Enix was producing in general. It just wasn't really captivating me like the previous Final Fantasies had. But I would like to revisit that game one day, and as the dust has settled, I feel like people are a lot more positive on 13 and some of its better aspects, so that's something that I would like to play. But what I do remember from that combat system was the stagger system, building up your opponent to stagger them and then do some crazy damage. Now, that's not something unique to 13. A lot of action games do tend to have some sort of stagger or pressure system, but the way that they implement that stagger system in Remake and Rebirth is super satisfying, especially once you find out an enemy's weakness, you can pressure them, and then you lead to that really big moment where you stagger them, they're stunned, you can do a ton of damage, but it's just this very rewarding aspect of combat that I think they just nailed. Now, what's kind of funny is Endo says he didn't really try to capture the original command-based menu system, he just wanted that feeling you got when you used the system. But in my opinion, he nailed both. That feeling I got playing the OG FF7 and going through my commands and picking what I wanted to do and seeing them play out, I still have that same excited feeling in the Remake Trilogy. The feeling of the ATB gauge being there, limit breaks, all of that stuff, it still does technically work in synergy with one another, and it's a really, really incredibly crafted combat system that, again, pays tribute to what the original game was, but it also embraces the more action elements that the genre is kind of aiming for. And man, just cycling through those menus, hearing those satisfying clicks and bleeps and bloops, I absolutely love it. I wouldn't mind though if in part 3, if they had some sort of DLC feature that changed the sound effects to match the original game when you had the little mouse icon with the hand, and those specific sound effects and selections and cancellations I think would be kind of cool. But I love how the menu sounds right now. It's beautifully simple but also distinct. Now, keep in mind, Endo came into the development cycle of 7 Remake about halfway through the development period, and he was coming off of Capcom working on Monster Hunter, specifically Monster Hunter World, and he says that taking the experience he had from working on that game at Capcom and then moving over to Square Enix and using all of their unique skills and all the cool technology they had, it created this chemical reaction. Man, I really would love to see more development footage of how this game came to be, 7 Remake in particular, because again, we know that it was originally being developed by CyberConnect. Visually, it looked like something more akin to Kingdom Hearts, and Hamaguchi has gone on record saying that version of the game that they had before Endo came in was not fun to play. So I really want to see like a developer featurette or documentary, maybe once this trilogy is all wrapped up, of how they created the Square Enix version of 7 Remake and Rebirth and Part 3 from the very beginning. I want to see what that combat system that CyberConnect had was. I want to see what Square Enix tried before Endo got there. I want to see all of that. I want to see Teruki Endo on his first day of work, walking into the Square Enix building, black trench coat, black t-shirt and pants, sunglasses. He walks up to Hamaguchi, takes off the sunglasses and goes, "I'm here to cook." I really want to see that because he created just such an incredibly fun, dynamic combat system that just blends so many things together and gets it all right, in my personal opinion. Now, one of the big things is that this is a trilogy, which allows for some pretty big benefits that Endo will go into, and that kind of wraps into what his whole idea and thought process is of focusing on each game, but not really getting too far ahead of himself. Endo goes on to say, I don't really give too much thought in terms of long-term planning, but put my all into whatever I'm working on. If I think too much about what's supposed to come ahead, I get too tied up in that thinking, feeling whatever I put in the moment will be incomplete. I want to put my full focus into whatever project I'm on, then add to it and build from there. I think that will eventually lead to a better conclusion, and a similar approach was used for the materia system, which I think is the right way to approach this. Having a trilogy, obviously there's some people that are like, this should have been one game, but if it was one game, it either wouldn't be out yet, or it would be a game that has some significant cuts that probably was not fun to play. But by Endo focusing on each individual game, he's allowed to just be like, okay, let's make this the best we possibly can. I'm not gonna worry about saving things for part 3. Or how we're going to even handle that right now. Our focus is specifically what we're working on now. And also the benefit of having a trilogy is you can put your game out and you can kind of gauge what people are saying. You yourself as developers can also be like, okay, this worked, but this didn't. And I'm sure they have tons of stats in regards to what players are using, what they're not using, where they struggled, what was maybe too easy, to kind of rebalance things and reconfigure them for the next game. It's a really big benefit to have, and especially when it comes to gameplay, which is like the core of every video game. It has to play right, and you're allowed essentially another opportunity to improve upon what you did right and wrong. And in regards to materia, they don't really hold back on that either. There are pieces of materia that you would have gotten towards the later stage of the original game that are available in Remake or Rebirth. So they don't really hold that stuff back. But what I will say, I wouldn't mind seeing a rework of the enemy skill materia. How it works in Rebirth is you get the materia and then you complete Chadley's VR challenges to learn new abilities. In the original game, if I remember correctly, you equipped a character with the enemy skill materia, you had to find an enemy that had a unique ability, and then you had to be hit by that unique ability to learn it. And I kind of like the way that works because it encourages players to really explore and fight different enemies and be like, oh, you have an ability I need to seek you out, get hit with that ability so I can learn it myself. So it really encourages exploration, messing around in combat, making things feel a little bit more unique and fresh instead of, kind of too on a track, so to speak. And if there's one complaint I have, you really experience this the most on hard mode, but we really desperately need materia loadouts for part 3. In hard mode in particular, I find that I'm constantly switching materia from character to character based on what battle I'm doing, especially when it comes to those boss battles. So to have a loadout where I can just put the materia that I need, the equipment that I need, and then I can just transfer it onto a character would be so much easier instead of being like, okay, I need Red and Barrett for this battle, so I'm gonna have to pick pieces from Cloud, Tifa, Yuffie, Kate, and put them on to the party. And then once we finish the battle, I have to remember what characters had their respective materia so I can kind of put things back the way they were. Now, Endo will go on to say that one of the most challenging things to create in this game was the ATB system, that gauge, how you built it up and how you balance it. And this is where Endo would spend a good chunk of his time when it came to creating and refining that combat. Endo goes on to say, you need to look at, for example, how much the ATB gauge accumulates, because you might be taking damage and still having it accumulate, or blocking. You need to balance how the gauge fills up and how the player uses ATB gauges. In the trial and error experimentation, at one point it got too easy to fill the ATB gauge. You'd get hit, that gauge would fill up, and you'd retaliate. It felt very simple and repetitive, and I had to tweak and adjust it. Part of me is wondering if that was maybe a holdover from the Cyber Connect period of time when they had that game in development. Again, it looked very similar to Kingdom Hearts, except you had what looked like 2 ATB gauges, so maybe it was just a little too simple at that time. But I get what Endo is saying here. You want to balance it out so it's not super easy. You want to make the player actually work for that ATB instead of them just having it from the get-go, or, oh, I blocked an attack, now I have 1 full charge, or I landed an attack and now I have another full charge. That's way too simple. So I imagine trying to balance that out must have been a nightmare, especially since there's so many variables in combat, from blocking and attacking, but also the enemies you're fighting. Some enemies have one big attack, some enemies have combo attacks, and then follow up with a spell. There's also the fact that equipment and some pieces of materia can also alter the speed at which you gain ATB. There's ATB boost, which gives you a big boost every, like 60 seconds or so, I believe, once it's maxed out. There are pieces of materia that will give you an ATB boost if another character uses an ability, or if you stagger an enemy, or if you block properly. So there's so many variables to balance there, and I feel like they really nailed it. And also, one criticism I've seen from a ton of people all the way back to 7 Remake was, I don't like using a full party. They want the other characters that they're not controlling to build up ATB just like you would if you were controlling them. So they basically just want to use Cloud, and they want the other two characters to build up that ATB fast so they don't have to switch to them. I don't see the point in that. The whole idea of this combat system, much like the original, is to utilize every character to the best of their ability, their strengths and their weaknesses. They want to encourage you as a player to switch between these characters to really learn how to use them and build up that ATB. If they just built ATB super fast without you actually having to use them, then it kind of defeats the purpose of having a party, and it makes things way too easy. If Aerith is just doing her own thing and suddenly she's got 2 ATB charges and I can fire off a level 3 spell, that's a little too simple. You want to encourage the player to earn that ATB, and I feel like the way they do it in Rebirth is so well done. It's super polished and seamless, switching from character to character and taking over them from the AI and using all of their abilities. So I love the way that they do it. And again, if you don't like using other characters, you can kind of play around with materia and equipment to kind of give them advantages that you don't have to switch to them so much. Now up next, Endo talks about who the most difficult character to design was, and it turns out it was Cait Sith. Endo goes on to say, with Cait Sith in that element of luck being a very strong component versus this being an action-based combat system, those two elements seem almost contradictory to each other. No matter how well you do the actions, luck changes the outcome, so it's typically not a good idea to put those elements in. But that said, luck is a core component of Cait Sith, so my challenge was trying to figure out how I can incorporate the element of luck without making it unfair to the player. If we jump back to the original FF7, I think all of us have that moment where we have Cait Sith in our party, we use our limit break, we roll the dice, and suddenly all of our teammates are dead. Game over, start over, you dumbass. It's like the initiation phase of being a Final Fantasy VII fan. We all go through that. But like as Endo says, this is primarily an action-based combat system, and when you have luck thrown in there, it can kind of throw some things off. So how do you take a luck-based character and incorporate that luck while also balancing the action? And I think the way that they did it in Rebirth really does work. And based on the amount of used Cait Sith, I don't recall there being any type of negative side effects from his abilities. Most of what he does offer different buffs, but those buffs are kind of dependent upon the luck level of Cait Sith. So if your luck level is kind of basic, you might roll a dice and get like a level 1 spell or a barrier, but the higher your luck stat is, you might get a level 3 spell. You might get a mana wall. You never really know. But I think by focusing primarily on just buffing the team instead of throwing in the negative stuff, I think that really kind of balances that out, and it makes Cait Sith a pretty fun character to use. And when you have him in the party, you technically now have a party of 4, because you can summon the Moogle, jump off of the Moogle, and that Moogle's just marching around the battlefield super happy and jolly, all fat and sassy, doing damage while you're running around as the cat, doing all kinds of cool stuff. And once you really wrap your head around Cait Sith, he is super broken. He's such a powerful character. I think it's the Moogle Uppercut, or like Moogle Knuckle is the name of it. That attack does insane amounts of damage. It's nuts. But he can also bring a summon onto the field and have them use a unique ability without actually bringing them on as a actual summon, which is pretty nuts. So I'm curious to see how they refine his combat style in part 3, because I think he's so much fun and he's got a lot of potential. And I do remember there was a panel that was held quite some time ago, and they were doing Q&As, and they asked the audience, who is your least favorite character to use? Unfortunately, a majority of people said Cait Sith, which ended up bumming out Endo pretty severely because he worked really hard on making that character. So Endo, I personally like Cait Sith. I think he did a fantastic job with him. Super fun to play, and I think maybe more people need to give him some credit. Cait Sith. Put him in your party, man. Play around with him. Have some fun. He's super cool. Now, at this point, Naoki Hamaguchi chimes in by saying that the course of the characters, what they had planned out, didn't really change from the beginning of the project. So he goes on to say, all of the playable characters implemented for both Remake and Rebirth were structured according to the initial directions we set for titles, meaning whatever they had planned initially for Cloud, they've basically kept him on that track. Obviously, there's going to be some evolutions here and there. You're going to take into consideration maybe player feedback, even the own developers' feedback, but they probably know what Cloud is going to be from game to game and how they're going to evolve his combat style, which is pretty cool. And again, that really helps the team focus down on crafting these characters because, like we mentioned in the previous video, Endo said that when you know what you need to do from the get-go and you know what characters are, what specific class, you're not going to suddenly just change them. Cloud isn't suddenly going to start using guns. Barrett's not suddenly going to get a sword. You know what track they're on. It kind of really focuses down that aspect of development, which is super nice. And we do know from previous videos that one of the original ideas they had for Rebirth that eventually got scrapped was they wanted Vincent and Sid to participate in that final battle. To what capacity, we don't know. I assume they would have been AI controlled, maybe like Red 13 was at the end of 7 Remake, but that must have been scrapped pretty early on, and I'm kind of glad they did. I wouldn't want to see like a half-baked version of Sid and Vincent there in the final battle. As cool as it would be to see them, I think they really want to save the full dev of those characters and what they're really going to be like for the full game. You don't want to give a negative impression of what those characters could be. And another thing I appreciate is that if something just doesn't work, maybe they planned it out from the beginning, they won't use it. We did learn recently that Cloud and Sephiroth initially had a second synergy ability, but for whatever reason, it just didn't work, so they scrapped it. So it's nice to know that they're not just putting stuff in the game because it's cool or they're trying to pad it out with the combat. If it doesn't work, it ain't going in there. Stick to your vision, and it works very well. Now, if there's one aspect of the game that the developers did kind of go back and forth on, it's that final boss gauntlet at the end of the game. Endo goes on to say, we wanted players to have that sense of a finale, but at the same time, we have to provide a sort of hurdle to overcome. It was a balance because we don't want to interrupt the battle and prevent the players from pouring themselves in emotionally. There was some thinking behind making the difficulty a bit less than a typical boss battle, but as we were building it and receiving feedback, there were comments that we wanted more bite, so it ended up becoming difficult. And that final boss gauntlet in Rebirth is pretty crazy. I think from beginning to end, if you don't die, it takes about an hour to get through all of those different fights. And again, trying to balance that must have been super difficult because you do want boss battles, especially if it's an end game boss battle, to be difficult. If it's a pushover, that sense of satisfaction just kind of deflates and it's not really fun. But you don't want it to be so difficult that it becomes a skill checkpoint that stops people from progressing through the game. And that can be applied to any boss, not just the final bosses. If you have a point in a game where the boss is just too insane, that can lead players to just put the game down and never come back because they're struggling so much that they can't get past it. But with the boss battle, especially it taking place after the death of Aerith, you still want the players to have that emotional impact. And if things are too hard and you're getting frustrated, you lose that emotional feeling you had before the fight. And now you're just focused on being mad and angry and like, oh, this is too cheap. I'm going to throw my controller and never play this game ever again. And I think as far as that final boss gauntlet goes, I think they balanced it just right, because each phase kind of has a gimmick. You start off with Jenova, you got your full party, and then it's just Cloud. And then everyone gets their hits in, and everyone comes back together, but Jenova's moveset changes. And then you get to Sephiroth with Cloud and Zack, and then he transforms, and you're basically having this two different fights, essentially Cloud focusing on Sephiroth Reborn, while the rest of the party is fighting him with a different gimmick, where his wings take on different elemental forms, and you have to use the opposite to actually damage him. And then when you get to the final phase, you've got Cloud and Aerith against Sephiroth, and he's got different phases of his fight. There's the one where he throws Masamune into the ground and pulls a Michael Jackson, and just puts his arms out and goes... And then he's got like the whispers coming out like crazy, like he's on the Bad Tour or something. It's insane. So I feel like they balanced it just right, added just the right amount of gimmicks to these fights too to make them feel different and challenging, but not to the point where it's like, man, I don't think I'm going to finish this game. Now, continuing on with challenge, Endo does say that he thinks it is important to add extra challenging things outside of the main story, which is why they did something like Weiss in the episode Integrate DLC. He would go on to say, that was added in for players who want to enjoy the game for as long as possible. I think Weiss is also a really good example of how to do a boss fight that's challenging but doable, because every phase that Weiss has a different gimmick. That first phase, you can't just fight him head on. He's going to counter everything, he's going to block everything and knock you down. And certain things that you got used to leading up to that point just don't work on him. You can't stagger him, you can't pressure him, until you realize, I gotta jump over this bitch. I flip over him, get my hits in, do some pressure and stagger damage, and then we go from there. And then there's a phase where only magic is really effective against him. So it's constantly evolving and forcing the player to really be like, okay, I gotta figure out what I'm doing in each phase so I can eventually put it all together and then win the fight. And to end, we have one final message from Endo where he says, looking at it from a career perspective, I would always love to make something more original. But looking at it from the Remake project, I feel like we started out with Remake and then what we did with Rebirth, everything finally kind of meshed properly. So from that perspective, it went well. I would agree. Again, you just see that evolution from Remake to Rebirth and them fully realizing that combat system and then building upon it with the synergy stuff, the skills and the abilities and how the summons are incorporated. The combat just also feels better. It feels tighter, more responsive. Air combat is now way more fun, and it leaves me excited to see what they're going to do with Part 3. What do they build upon with these characters? What changes do people like Red 13 and Kate Sith go through for Part 3? What are Sid and Vincent going to be like? What improvements do they make on Zack? Because you know he's coming back and he's going to be playable. What else is he going to be able to do in that third game? And with Part 3 being the end of the trilogy, I think Endo's really going to want to go all out with that combat system. I don't think they're going to alter it so much to the point where it's overwhelming. I still think we'll have what we have in Rebirth, but they'll add a few different pieces on top of that to make it feel fresher. Again, I'm expecting synergy abilities with 3 characters. Maybe throw in some synergy limit breaks to make it insane. Maybe they change up the summons a little bit, which I don't really have an issue with. I kind of like how the summons work. It's super cool to call them out onto the field and fight alongside them. It's a really interesting visual, but it just makes combat so much cooler because it's like, yeah, I got Odin by my side now, bitch. What are you gonna do now? It's super fun. And again, this combat system is so good, and it's just so Final Fantasy by taking inspiration from what came before, but embracing the future of what the franchise has seemingly always wanted to do, and that's add action. So I really hope that moving forward, CS1 comes back to this combat system. Maybe other developers within Square Enix are able to use that combat system and kind of put their own twist on it for their games, specifically Final Fantasy, that is, whether it's a mainline or a spin-off, what have you. I just think what they've come up with is just so incredible, super satisfying. It's mostly universally loved. There are some people that are like, I hate it, it sucks, Teruki Endo ruined my childhood, some pretty insane stuff, but for the most part, I think we all really appreciate this combat system and what they were able to do in 7 Remake. But with that being said, that is the video. Let me know in the comments down below what you thought of this interview. I also would love to know who is your favorite character to use in Rebirth, but also who is your favorite party to use. For me, it's Cloud, Barrett, and Aerith, or as I like to call them, Team Blairith, or Team You Came to the Wrong Neighborhood, motherfucker, because we're gonna fuck you up. Because those are probably my 3 most comfortable characters to use. Cloud is an incredible all-arounder. Aerith's got the powerful magic and wards. Barrett is the ranged attacker that can provide support, and he can also kind of get in close at times. So I think it's a very well-rounded, powerful party. But I would love to hear what you guys think in the comments down below. I am Curious Corduroy. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.